Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual program, Blocking the Vote, Voter Suppression Then and Now. We are pleased that all of you are here with us today and are tuning in for this virtual program. My name is Martha Osterbiel. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And before we get started, I would just like to encourage all of you to utilize the chat function. We are using Zoom webinars and we'd love to see you all engage with us and with your fellow attendees. You can do so by clicking that chat icon at the bottom of your screen and make sure you're toggling so that you're talking to all panelists and attendees if you'd like for everybody to see your chat. We are also going to leave some time at the end of the program to answer some questions from all of you. And so you can ask questions for any of our panelists using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We are going to get started. And so I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Allison Tolman. She is the Vice President of Collections and Interpretation at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And she'll be moderating today's conversation. So welcome, Allie.
Thanks, Martha. And I am going to introduce our amazing panelists today who are going to be having such an important conversation. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Dennis Patrick Halpin. He's an associate professor and associate chair for the Department of History at Virginia Tech. He is the author of the 2019 publication, Brotherhood and Liberty, Black Reconstruction and Its Legacies in Baltimore, 1865 to 1920, which describes how Baltimore's African-American community used activism to define citizenship and freedom after the Civil War. This publication makes a significant contribution to our understanding of African-American politics from the age of emancipation through Jim Crow to the law and order policies of the progressive era. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I would also like to introduce Elaine Weiss. She is an award-winning journalist, writer, and historian whose writings have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Boston Globe, and The Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as in reports and documentaries for the National Public Radio and Voice of America. Her 2018 book, The Women's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, provides a narrative account of how American women won their own freedom in the dramatic climax of the women's suffrage movement in what can be considered the opening campaign in the great 20th century battle for civil rights. Welcome, Elaine.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, our third panelist is trying to hop back on with all of the weather that we're having today. We're having a bit of an internet issue, but I'm going to introduce her now and we'll welcome her again when she rejoins us. Our third panelist will be Nicole Hanson-Mundell. She is the executive director of Out for Justice, a grassroots nonprofit organization working for the reform of policies and practices that adversely affect voting rights for eligible incarcerated voters and returning citizens. Recently, Out for Justice created an Expand the Vote, Expand the Ballot coalition that successfully advocated for and facilitated a historic expansion of ballot access to eligible incarcerated voters in the state of Maryland, now requiring the Maryland Board of Elections to provide voters with election information, voter registration applications, mail-in ballot request forms, and paid postage. So when Nicole gets in, we will welcome her in person. So I wanted to start our conversation today with the 15th and 19th Amendments. The 15th Amendment, it's the 150th anniversary, and it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Were intended to grant votes to first all African-American men and then all women, but it was really just the beginning for voting rights. Dennis and Elaine, could you talk about some misconceptions that we have with the 15th and 19th Amendment, what they were intended to do and what they really did? Oh, and hello, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
Well, great. Yeah. Once again, thanks, Allison and Martha, for organizing this. And thank you all for attending. I wish I could be there instead of in my basement, which also doubles as my classroom this semester, and unfortunately, probably this academic year as well. So let's talk about the 15th Amendment and what it does. It's passed in 1869. by a then overwhelmingly Republican Congress. It's ratified the next year. And the amendment was simple but revolutionary. It stated that, quote, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or a previous condition of servitude. So in clear, concise terms, the 15th Amendment changed the electorate in the United States. This is only approximately 4 years after the end of the Civil War. And the amendment extends the franchise to African-American men. It notably does not include women in its provisions. But when we look at the amendment and we think about it, the historical memory of the amendment and its passage and ratification has become inextricably linked with Reconstruction. So the period after the Civil War, when the federal government reforged the nation. And there's good reason for this association. The 15th Amendment, along with the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which extended citizenship and legal rights to formerly enslaved people, is known as one of the Reconstruction amendments. But I think when we look at the amendment, when we look at its passage, one of the things is we recognize its historical import. But I also think we underestimate how revolutionary it was. It certainly was. It was limited in that it didn't extend the right to vote to women. But when we look at it, we also, I don't think, we don't recognize the full scope of what it did, because I think when we look at the 15th Amendment, we too often think of it as exclusively targeting the states of the former Confederacy, all the states that seceded, the southern states that seceded in an attempt to maintain the institution of slavery. And the fact of the matter is the truth is much more complex, because throughout the North, in the years leading up to the Civil War and in the years immediately after the Civil War, African Americans were expressly denied the right to vote or disqualified using mainly property qualifications. So when we look at the passage and the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, we see that at this moment, African American men could not vote in places like Connecticut or Ohio, Wisconsin, New York, and in Maryland. So to put that into perspective, right, by this moment, Black men had already voted in places like Florida and South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. Maryland itself would not even ratify the amendment until 1973, though they were forced to abide by it, beginning with the election of 1870. So I think when we talk about the 15th Amendment, we need to recognize that it augured not just a change in the South, but it augured a political reckoning in the North as well. The ratification of the 15th Amendment brought Reconstruction to the North as well as to the South. And in this, we have something important to realize, because when we talk about racism and we talk about voter suppression, especially race-based voter suppression, this is not a Southern phenomenon, right? This is certainly, the South is guilty of engaging in many of these things, but too often that guilt has kind of overshadowed other problems that existed throughout the nation at this time. So historically speaking, both racism and voter suppression have not been exclusively Southern problems, but we need to think of them as American problems. And when we look at the passage of the 15th Amendment, we see that very clearly.
Thank you, Dennis. That is so interesting that the right to vote was already given for some elections in the South, because you would think traditionally that you always think of the South as the oppressors. So it's incredibly interesting that, it was really some Northern states that were holding back that right to vote. Elaine, could you talk about, similarly with the 19th Amendment, who actually gets the right to vote and who is excluded from that amendment?
Sure. Well, we should remember that the 19th Amendment was actually introduced into Congress in 1878, only 8 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And it was drafted and introduced, it was drafted by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two names we do usually know in the suffrage movement. And it was felt necessary to have this new amendment because the 15th Amendment did not include women. Again, we know that the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement was called then, and the abolition movement were very entwined, and many of the same leaders were and participants were in both movements. And so in the Reconstruction, women expected to get the right to vote along with the formerly enslaved men. And this is a great heartbreaking rift that is perpetrated upon this movement. Two disenfranchised classes told that only one of you can be made full citizens to vote. And so women are very angry, and they say, okay, you will not put those three little letters in, shall not be denied by race or by sex, and we will have to go on our own. And so we see the movements have to go their own ways at that point. And so it's introduced in 1878. It is stalled in Congress for 40 years. 40 years. Congress, every year the suffragists go up and testify before whatever committee is hearing this. It goes back into the file cabinet, and it's voted down in committee or on the floor of Congress 28 times. When it finally emerges in 1919, after World War I, and it is even it's in the last throes of getting a passage through the Senate, which was the more recalcitrant body at that point, there were still amendments being proposed to limit the scope of the 19th Amendment, which, by the way, is the exact same language as the 15th Amendment. It's modeled on the 15th Amendment, to say only white women would get the vote. And that's beaten back. The suffragists don't want it. Certainly, they have enough friends in the Senate. They're able to beat that back. But we see what's coming. And basically, the 19th Amendment, legally, constitutionally, does give the right to vote to all eligible women citizens over the age of 21, which was the age of majority then, the voting age then. And what we see is that some women are actually legally not included, which is Asian American women and Native American women, who are not considered citizens in 1920 when it's ratified. But African American women are considered citizens. And so they are constitutionally given the right to vote by the 19th Amendment. What we will see is that they will be deprived of the vote in many places in the southern states, mostly by racist state laws, racist Jim Crow laws, which will use intimidation and literacy tests, ridiculous literacy tests, and poll taxes to keep Black women from the vote. But they are voting in the North and in the West. And so we have to understand that the 19th Amendment really does give the right to vote to all eligible women citizens, but we will see a states' rights campaign, the same states that will also be denying the vote to Black Americans up until the Voting Rights Act. And many of those same states are engaged in voter suppression today. So we see this continuum, but it is actually not the 19th Amendment that's at fault in this.
The federal government giveth and the state and local take away.
Yes.
Hi, Nicole. We're glad that you were able to reconnect with us. Could you talk about how that voter suppression appears today? We've talked about how the amendments, what they intended to do. And then, of course, we have the Voting Rights Act in 1965, where we try to make sure that everyone can vote. That's not true. Can you talk about what you see with voter suppression today, especially with your work with returning citizens and eligible incarcerated voters?
Sure. And 128 participants on this call. And I don't know if they're just Maryland people or they're people nationally, but And thank you all for joining us in this very important discussion. What I hear from the historians is the story of today. It does not feel like anything has changed from the days of the 19th Amendment, the days of the 15th Amendment. In fact, it does not feel down here on the ground as if anything has changed. It does not feel like the federal government has acknowledged and even participating in this idea that we all are eligible to vote. And you know, oftentimes the federal government implements policies and they leave it up to the states to determine, you know, how they will work the law. And we don't even feel here in Maryland that the state is doing its due diligence at ensuring that all individuals are eligible to vote. And so for us, voter suppression also includes not informing people. When you fail to tell an individual what their rights are, you are essentially participating in voter suppression. And we don't talk about that a lot, right? We talk about the telling, the boards issuing documents. We talk about the boards misquoting the law, but rarely do we talk about the failure to disseminate the information is also voter suppression. What we do know is like somewhere 1974, the federal government like introduced, I don't know, the Supreme Court kind of ruled that individuals who were sitting in our jails pre-trial, not yet convicted of anything, were eligible to vote, right? This is the new Jim Crow. This is the new ways that America enslaves Black and brown people. And so because these individuals do not have the monies to free themselves, they then become captive of the state and are denied their rights, right? In particular, voting rights. I mean, we're not going to talk about all the other human rights that individuals are denied when they're sitting in our prisons and jails, not yet convicted of anything. And so what we found is that and I think you'll get into this about the work that has been happening locally that kind of supports the statewide movement around expanding the ballot, expanding the vote. But we just a week ago witnessed clear voter suppression here in Baltimore City. So in 2015, a piece of legislation was introduced that kind of completed the voting rights, or is attempted to complete the voting rights work that happened in Maryland. And that law indicated that if you were on probation and parole, you too had the right to vote. Because before then, if you were coming out of jail with a felony or misdemeanor, you had to wait until you were finished your completion, your court order completion sentence. And that meant that you had to wait until you got off of probation and parole in order for you to become eligible. But the 2015 policy that was passed by the Maryland General Assembly and then later vetoed by Governor Hogan, and the legislators overrode that veto in 2016, made over 40,000 individuals in this state eligible to vote. Right? And what we saw in Baltimore City back then was that a letter was generated to constituents in Baltimore City telling them that their voter registration forms were invalid. And so immediately the advocates sprang into action. There was a lawsuit initiated by a group called Voice at the time that talked about not only the State Board of Elections, but the Department of Corrections suppressing the vote of those eligible voters in pretrial detention centers. So
40,000 voters that were given the right to vote. I don't think
over 40,000 voters were given the right to vote. And now today, 2 weeks ago, that same letter was generated to over 100 Baltimore residents. So think about this. If 100 people receive a letter stating from the actual office that whose sole job is to ensure eligibility that they cannot vote, they then talk to another person, which means that now 200 people think that these individuals cannot vote. And God knows if that 100 people then talk to another 100 people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
so the ripple effect that this letter has had, we can't even imagine what the impact is right now.
Misinformation is probably the strongest form of voter suppression that we have today. And that's such a large portion of the Maryland population that did not have the right to vote, or did, but didn't think they did. And that's, something important that we talk about, that not everyone has the right to vote. And even those who do are being suppressed actively. And I think that that's a great example of that. When you mentioned incarcerated voters, people who don't have the right to vote, it actually made me think back, Dennis, something in your book you talk about is one of the legislative things they did were to take people into jail a couple days before election. They would hold them. I was wondering if you can talk about how soon after African-American men were granted the right to vote, we saw legislation come into play to attempt to first restrict and then to take away their right. Could you talk a little bit about that early battle?
Yeah, sure. And, one of the things that we have to recognize is that, and oftentimes Reconstruction is taught as this period as being a failure and of corruption. And the truth of the matter is that Reconstruction, while certainly imperfect, worked for a while. We see large numbers of African-American men being able to vote in places like South Carolina and Louisiana. There's a whole slew of Black legislators that are going to be elected during this period. But we also see in the immediate years after the 15th Amendment is passed, a lot of the hallmarks of what Nicole is talking about here. And I always, encourage people to think holistically about voter suppression, right? We can all think of the Jim Crow laws that are passed beginning in the late 1880s and early 1890s, which I'll talk about in a second. But I also think we need to move beyond that because, as Allison pointed out, this is a process. This wasn't something that was just instituted overnight. And right, when we look at this, the immediate attempts at suppressing the vote was mostly done outside the law. For instance, throughout the South, state governments use felony conviction in an attempt to disfranchise Black voters. And as Reconstruction begins to fade, as the North loses interest in enforcing Reconstruction, every Southern state except for Texas changes their laws so that they could disfranchise men convicted of mostly petty theft and minor property crimes. And the evidence tells us that this was targeted disproportionately at African Americans throughout the South. And, one of the things that's interesting about this is that Southerners saw these measures as kind of an insurance policy. They didn't have a lot of faith that some of the more flagrant legislative attempts that they were undertaking to suppress the vote, they didn't think that would stand court challenges. And so that they see it as an insurance policy, but as we know, most of these laws do end up withstanding court challenges, and the combination of both the laws and these kind of extra legal or using the criminal justice system to disfranchise Black voters really starts that process. And again, we can see this in Baltimore, as Allison hinted at here in the 1890s. The Democratic Party, which had controlled affairs in the city and the state for a long time, up until the 1890s, had lost in the 1895 election. And they're trying to regain power in the city and state government. And during this time, if you go to the pages of like the Afro-American, right, you have a lot of Black citizens testifying that the police are rounding up Black men in and around Election Day in order to keep them from voting. And then they're complementing this with some of the examples of legally based voter suppression, some of the more familiar things that a lot of people know about. So, right, beginning in the late 1880s, but really accelerating throughout the 1890s, we see Southern states starting to use things like the grandfather clause or the poll tax. And what they're trying to do is not at first eliminate the Black vote, but limit it. It's only after these legislative these laws withstand challenges that they accelerate to then trying to flat out eliminate the Black vote. And again, we can see this in Maryland as well. First, politicians tried to use things like the criminal justice system to disfranchise Black men. In 1901, they passed a law called the Wilson Law, which removed, so when you got a ballot, you would see like the party emblems on the ballot. And this was a way that semi-literate or illiterate voters could vote a straight ticket. They eliminate that in an effort to confuse voters. And then just a few years after that, in 1904, Maryland begins the first of 3 unsuccessful attempts to legally disfranchise African-American voters. It's a series of 3 laws. The first one was known as the Poe Amendment, the second was the Straus Amendment, and the third was the Diggs Amendment. And these efforts involve various different tools, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, things of that nature. They ultimately failed, but they failed only because of the steadfast resistance and activism of Black men and women in Baltimore and throughout the state of Maryland.
I just want to be really clear about something, right? Because I'm no historian, right? That is not my study. Mm-hmm. But when I hear you say things like, you know, let's move beyond this, when I hear you say that the original intent was not to eliminate the vote at first, you know, I want to respectfully push back on that. Mm-hmm. When it comes to Black and brown people in this country, the ultimate goal was always to eliminate Black and brown people. There was never from where I sit as a Black woman, as a daughter, a granddaughter of a Korean War veteran, I have never sat in a place where I felt like this country did not attempt to disenfranchise my ancestors. I have always set from the world view that this was not a system that was designed for us, and that we just had to figure out a way to fit in, and we had to fight for our rights. And so, you know, I respectfully push back that the goal was not always to disenfranchise us and that it kind of led up to that. No, the goal from where I sit was that we were always, the goal was always to make sure that we were treated as 3/5 of a human. The goal was always that we were not good enough, and that these tactics that you talk about was just an attempt to find a way to do it legally, right? Mm-hmm. And that is why an organization like Out for Justice is so important, is because our mission is to educate, engage, and empower the reentry community around the legislative process. We know that this is not a system that was designed for us, but we have to figure out ways to make it work for us as long as we choose to live in this system. And it is through the policy that we educate ourselves, we study, we write our own policy, and we lead our own campaigns. And we are the voice for our own liberation, right? And so, you know, the legislative process is extremely one real tool that we use to ensure our successful reentry.
Mm-hmm. And Dennis, in his book, A Brotherhood for Liberty, he actually talks about how Black activist groups, grassroots organizations similar to Out for Justice today, are really the reason that these amendments don't pass in the state of Maryland. The Straus, the Diggs, and the Poe Amendment that try and take away your right to vote, which target were specifically to target Black voters and make sure they don't vote because they're illiterate, because they're, the generation before them were enslaved. The fact that they don't have, I believe, and Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the dig, so that if you were a white man, you didn't have to pay attention to it, but if you were Black, you had to prove that you owned land. I mean, these were specifically to target Black voters, and it was because of grassroots organizations that they don't pass in Maryland.
Yeah, and absolutely, and Nicole, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And just to be clear about what I'm saying is that these were strategic decisions. You're right. Like the end goal was to disenfranchise Black voters, but at the moment when it wasn't clear whether these laws would withstand legal challenges, that they were more limited at first, and then once those laws once those laws did withstand legal challenges, then they kept escalating them. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, their strategy was to pick at it until it was all gone.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
The overall goal was always, as you say, Nicole, to take away the vote. I want to switch gears just to talk to Elaine about the 19th Amendment, because just like the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment is especially contentious in Maryland. Can you talk about the suffrage movement specifically for women in Maryland and what they were up against during that movement?
Sure. Maryland was a very well-organized suffrage state. There were hundreds of suffrage clubs and societies all around the state. It had a little bit of a late start because it is and was a Southern state. And so the idea of women having equal rights and to some, the threat of its Black residents being able to vote made it tough going. But there were some very powerful suffrage leaders here. They would do things like have a pilgrimage where they were in a covered wagon from and go from Hagerstown to St. Mary's City and across and down the state, and they would sign up women to support suffrage. But there was also a very strong anti-suffrage movement here. And if you look at the Maryland Association opposed to women's suffrage at around 1913, 15, 17, you'll see some of the most famous names in Baltimore history. You'll see the names of women whose family names are now street names around Maryland. And so these are from very wealthy, self-satisfied women who basically the status quo is just fine for them and they're not interested. The other thing you see is that corporate interests play a part. The idea of women voting, this entire new block of voting citizens, the 19th Amendment affected 27 million women. This doubles the electorate. And so the idea of shaking up the status quo was considered very dangerous by certain corporations. For instance, the railroads. And you say, what do the railroads have to do with women's suffrage? Well, the railroads were known in states like Maryland, also Tennessee, which I write about in my book, pretty much owned the state legislatures. They had bought them off with all kinds of contributions, bribes, free passes for train rides. They owned the legislatures. And the idea of having to buy new legislators who might have been elected with women's votes was not very palatable. And they also felt that they might have to reconvince these legislators to support the favors they needed at both the state level and the national level. You also see manufacturers, and those were very prominent in Maryland, who fear that if women can vote, they might want to abolish child labor. And these factories were built on the cheap, exploitive child labor. So you see corporate interests, and then you, of course, see the racial dynamics. And one of the most active attorneys fighting the idea of women's suffrage, specifically Black women's suffrage in Maryland, is a name who in the legal community is still resonates here in Maryland, William Marbury. William Marbury is one of the leaders of something called the American Constitutional League, which is the lawyers' committee for anti-suffrage. And he writes a letter to this is now, he leads the effort to deny ratification of the 19th Amendment. The Maryland legislature rejected ratification, did not ratify the 19th Amendment. In fact, would not even ceremonially ratify it. As Dennis said, the 15th Amendment until 1973 or 4. Well, it was 1958 when Maryland finally gets around to accepting the 19th Amendment. And what we will see is that they will not only reject it, but they will send emissaries. The state legislature sent the president of the Senate and several other legislators to the other southern states to convince them not to ratify. And they are sitting in Tennessee, in Nashville, in the State House with the anti-suffrage contingent there, trying to make sure that Tennessee kills the 19th Amendment. And then what will happen, just sort of putting salt in the wounds, is they will, the St. Marbury and these same lawyers will fight the 19th Amendment. They will bring suit that the 19th Amendment goes against the state constitution, which says white men can vote, and they will bring that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it won't be dismissed from the Supreme Court until Justice Brandeis writes an opinion in 1922 and says, this is not, we're not discussing this, it's done. This is a federal amendment. But Maryland will fight to the tooth to not allow basically Black women to vote, just as Nicole has said.
Yes, and Nicole.
If I may, Allison,
yes.
We're talking about the women's suffrage movement, and I think, we have to be honest that, when it comes to that movement back then, its worst offense may be that it really rendered nearly invisible the Black woman who labored in the suffrage vineyard, and that it kind of looked away from the racism that tightened the grip on the fight for women's votes in the years after the Civil War, right? And historians who are not inclined to really hero worship from the article that was written, really including, Elisa Barkley Brown and Rosalind, Miss Penn have recently really provided an really uninspiring portrait of this once neglected period of time, and really stripped of her halo, set in the campaign's principal philosopher. Really is exposed as this classical liberal racist who embrace fairness in the abstract while really publicly insinuating very bigoted views of African American men, whom she characterized as Sambos and rapists in the period just after the war. So really the suffrage struggle itself really took on a similar flavor to white supremacy, and really selling out the interests of African American women. And when it became politically okay to do so. So this portrayal of trust really, opened a rift between Black and white feminists that really persists today. And so, we have to make sure that we are.
There is some wonderful literature on the Black women's suffrage movement. The Afro-American did a supplemental on it, and I'm hoping that those behind the scenes at MCHC will be able to plug it into our chat, because it is a wonderful resource to talk about the divide in the 19th Amendment, the reasons behind it, and how racism took shape in all suffrage movements. Nicole, you've talked before about Senate Bill 340, House Bill 980, Hogan's veto, and how it had to be overcome. This legislative loophole, it was something that happened in every suffrage movement where people tried to say, for example, with women's suffrage, and Elaine could talk about this, but the state tried to say it goes against our Constitution, as she mentioned, so we don't have to do it as a state. I'm wondering if you can talk about the legislation what work still needs to be done in legislation to really return votes? Because I know we've talked about generational disadvantage and how there still needs to be work done. So could you talk about legislative work that could still be done to advance voting rights in the African-American community specifically?
Yes, yes. And really before I go into that, I just want to make sure, that it's very clear that, Black feminists in particular are very eager to see if these remembrances own up to the real history of the fight for the right to vote, whether Black suffragists appear in them. But what is really happening today and what is needed, right? And so coming out of the primary election, Out for Justice was able to co-opt its way onto the State Board of Elections advisory committee, because the State Board had really screwed up the elections, particularly in places like Baltimore City and Prince George's County. And so it was eager, I guess, for them to, get some advocates on their side to begin to change the reputation of the State Board of Elections. And surely formerly incarcerated people were not on the menu at that time. But we got our way on this advisory committee. And what we found is that this was a diverse group of individuals who had interest in all areas of voting, right? And so constantly I had to bring up every meeting, Allison, what about the reentry community? What about our individuals sitting in our prisons and jails? What are you all going to do? Because every election year, we know that it's going to be people sitting in our prisons and jails. It's not rocket science, right? And so, meeting after meeting, I would get silence. Sometimes I will only get 5 minutes on the agenda. And finally, they got tired of me standing up for my rights and the rights of my people, that they said, Nicole, what do you want to do? What does Out for Justice want us to do? And we said, we want you to do your job. The sole mission of the State Board of Elections is to ensure ballot access to all eligible voters, right, Allison? And so they said, well, how do you want us to do that? And we said, we want you to send informational packets into every jail in this state. Every 28 counties, we want information sent in by the Board of Elections, right? And so they said, well, if you guys, if you can do it for us, we'll do it, right? And so we had to begin to prepare the packets that is now disseminated across the state, which includes voter registration forms, absentee ballot request forms, infographics for people who are not the best with words, but can understand things through pictures, pre-page postage, right? Mm-hmm. And we developed this packet for the Board of Elections to send out. But then the Board of Elections said, well, how are we going to know who to send it to? And we're, in our minds, it's like, you are the head of this agency. Surely you can call ahead of another agency and get information if you need it. But they somehow didn't feel like they had the capacity to do that or even should do that. And so Out for Justice, we took it upon ourselves to contact every local detention center and jail and even prison where eligible voters was. And we contacted each of those institutions and asked them, we need a list of all of your pre-trial eligible voters and individuals who had misdemeanor convictions, because in the state of Maryland, the only people that cannot vote in the state of Maryland are individuals who are charged with buying and selling votes. And that is not a real problem that we have in Maryland, right? And I think also individuals who have certain mental health issues, but I think they even are able to be supported in that way somehow. But I'm not an expert on that. And so what we did was when we got the list in Allison, we then sent the State Board of Elections that list and said, see, so we had to show the State Board of Elections not only what was necessary, but what was possible, right? And that leads me into your question. You asked, what is the policy that we attempted to push last legislative session before COVID hit? And it
expand the vote, expand the ballot.
Yes, and what that did was it required that the State Board of Elections and the Department of Corrections work together and the local detention centers and wardens across the state work together to create protocol that would allow voting access to those eligible voters, right? It's that, the state board, and then also make sure that you are reporting back to us, back to the state, how many people actually registered, how many people actually was able to vote, and work with local grassroots organizations like Out for Justice, like Common Cause Maryland, like the League of Women Voters, like Maryland Justice Project. Work with us because we are the ones who are closest to the issue, the impacted people, and we could help to advise you how to make this thing happen. And so, in some ways, I'm kind of glad that the law did not pass, right? And you would never hear me say that ever. But the reason why I'm glad is because now we really have some real data. We have some experiences, and now other organizations are able to witness what we were able to do. Because Out for Justice has always had voting rights as the top of our agenda. We went behind the walls in 2018 and registered over 85 women to vote in the Baltimore City Detention Center, even in the middle of a pandemic. A warden in Howard County, a red county, or purple county, or conservative county, allowed us in his facility to ensure that everybody in that jail had access to the ballot. And so what we did was we showed the legislators in real time the policy that we were introducing, what it actually looks like in real time. And that's what we were able to do.
Thank you. That access of information is definitely a very important part of creating new legislation, is spreading that information. Okay, so we are running a little behind. I'm going to switch gears. We are going to talk about a different type of voter suppression. And I feel like when voter suppression comes up, this is the one that people automatically think of. And it, right now, we don't even know if this is that prevalent because we just started early voting in Maryland. But intimidation or violence. Dennis, after the 15th Amendment, new voters were met with violence in parts of the nation. Could you talk about this and whether or not that violence existed in Maryland?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give two brief examples. We could sadly give many, many different examples. So Maryland, Baltimore in particular, and again, important to keep in mind that Maryland had, although was a state with slaves, did not secede during the Civil War, but nevertheless, 5 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment and the election of 1875, Democratic mobs attacked Republican voters, including many African Americans. The Chicago Tribune described the scene as, quote, a dark and bloody day in the history of Baltimore. Justice vacated her seat. Law was thrown aside, and for 12 hours, unionism ruled the city. The legally constituted authorities making no resistance. So, right, we see this, very early on after the 15th Amendment is passed. We also see violence surrounding elections in states further south. One of the most horrific acts of violence occurred 2 years previous to what I just described in Maryland and Baltimore on Easter Sunday in 1873. That year, it was a contested election. It was a very heated election. The governor's seat was up for election in the state of Louisiana, and the Republican candidate, William Pitt Kellogg had won, but President Grant had to send down troops to maintain order. Black Louisianans, fearful that William Pitt Kellogg, who they largely had voted for, was going to be thrown out of office by armed white supremacists, go to the courthouse. Many of them veterans of the Civil War, had been involved in militias. And there they were met by a heavily armed terrorist group that was known as the White League, very similar to the Ku Klux Klan, who came to oppose the civil rights protesters. Members of the White League surrounded the courthouse, and the two groups began to fire upon each other, but outnumbered and really outgunned. The Black protesters that had gathered surrendered. Nevertheless, the White League killed that day somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 people, including about 50 who had already surrendered. So, right, when we look at these violence, it's sending us multiple messages, but I'll highlight too, white redeemers, white supremacists in these states would resort to violence when they didn't like the outcome of an election, or they were fearful of that outcome. And I also think, these acts of violence also sent other messages that resonated beyond that particular election, and that is for Black voters, right? Voting in the future would be a dangerous proposition. So it's always sending these kind of multiple messages. But we could, there's just so many examples of violence around voting, particularly in the 19th century, but continuing into the 20th as well.
Thank you, Dennis. You talk about that sort of recurring, and I think that we can see that now with information being so readily available. You may see something that happened before that happening in another part of the country, and it causes fear, which actually that creation of fear through intimidation, whether you see it in person or online, can have repercussions. Nicole, I'm wondering if you can talk about thinking to that, the role of today having bipartisan poll observation. So it's not just one side at the polls, you're seeing both parties there, and how that can help prevent intimidation and violence.
Or even, not just the representation of parties, but the representation of nonpartisan groups, right? That helps the public feel, more comfortable that nobody has a specific stake in this thing. It's not about my person winning or not, right? But let's talk about this voter suppression. We're talking about deceptive practices through flyers and robocalls. We're talking about inadequate number of functioning machines that will get people just frustrated and leave. We're talking about inadequate and poorly trained staff. Allison, in Prince George's County, a Board of Elections member was at a press conference and misquoted the law as it relates to formerly incarcerated people. You're talking about the barriers for assistance by family members and others to help folks vote. Let's talk about the barriers of homeless voters for voter registration, right? We have mega churches, whether it is the Catholic Church or whatever church, that could allow for homeless voters to use that address as a means to be able to get their voter card. But this not, we're also talking about brown people as well. You're talking about not having to show your ID, and it was a time you didn't need to have a driver's license or ID to be able to vote. But now that you do, we're talking about our Native Americans, right? Being suppressed and being denied access to the ballot. And so I really think that, yes, having both parties available, but I also know that police at polling places is also intimidating. Even though we had some issues with a drop-in box or security, that's just, a needle in a haystack. That is not the norm in Baltimore for people to be angry and aggressive during early voting or on election day. People are feeling very happy during this time. People are feeling very excited. They're feeling empowered. And so, for us, as a nonpartisan organization, we feel that more nonpartisan organizations should be supported in this way. Funding should be allocated for us to be able to go out there and merely educate people to vote, as opposed to telling them who to vote for, pretty much letting them know of the job descriptions of those individuals who are seeking your vote, educating them about the ballot questions and those types of things. So
Thank you, Nicole. I think that is actually a very important part that you just touched on, informing voters of what they're voting for. Because I'm thinking, Dennis, back to your book, you're talking about how Black activists played an integral role in keeping voter suppression out of Maryland, and how they worked with making sure the right people were elected and with the right thoughts in mind. Could you talk a little bit about your book, Brotherhood of Liberty, Black Reconstruction and Its Legacies in Baltimore, and that activism side? I want to end us on a positive note because we have been talking about the suppression of votes. So let's talk about activism and how we've seen it historically and can do that today.
Yeah, I mean, you really see this in the first years of the 20th century where, when you looked at Maryland and you look at the voting path, the demographics of the state in the early 20th century and the way that the state had unfolded politically, it really seemed like it was very possible that these voting suppression measures would pass. But what we see happening here, and I think it's a lesson that we can think of today, right, is that this activism really took on a community form. This was led through Black churches in this period, but also involved other organizations that worked alongside, sometimes with, sometimes just alongside the Black churches. But we also, and I'll give a shout out to Beverly Carter, who I know is here today and is doing work on Black women and their efforts to help stop these amendments. We see Black women, even though they don't have the right to vote in the early 20th century, playing numerous roles, from boycotting different businesses to holding kind of makeshift voter education schools, sometimes in their own homes, doing fundraising efforts. So, right, it takes all of these efforts to kind of come together to help defeat these laws. And it also takes some tenaciousness, right? I mean, these activists that I discuss in the book are successful, but the story doesn't end there just because they were able to defeat these laws. This is something that they constantly had to pay attention to. And of course, with everything that Nicole has been saying and everything that we know, right, unfortunately, a lot of the things that I look at and document in the book sound very similar and familiar to what Nicole is talking about that's happening today. So, right, all of these things come together, and it's a lot of work. And for the people in my book, they didn't even necessarily live to see the goals that they were working for come true. But what they did do was they laid a foundation and created this kind of generational activism that was built upon by succeeding generations.
And Elaine, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because you mentioned at the top of our program that the women's suffrage movement in the 1870s, when they're asking for it, and then it actually coming to fruition in 1920, many women didn't make it to see it in fruition. So can you talk about that multi-generational movement and how setting goals and strategies in the movement of millions of women over multiple generations?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's so striking about the movement. And again, Nicole is right. It is a segregated movement for the most part. There are thousands, tens of thousands of African-American women who are working to organize their communities to get the vote in Maryland and every other state. But the women who begin it aren't alive when the 19th Amendment, which is really, again, not an end into itself, but a milestone in this continuing expansion of the vote. Remember, the Constitution does not promise the vote to anyone. It does not guarantee the vote to anyone. And we have to rely on the states because that's the way our federalist system is constructed. And so these women have to persist through more than 75 years, and then another almost 50 years till we get to the Voting Rights Act. And as we know, the Voting Rights Act has been eviscerated in its enforcement provisions again. So the idea of nurturing a next generation was very important to them. And we see women like Susan Anthony bringing a coterie of women around her who she grooms for succession planning, as we call it today. mentoring, training, giving them more responsibility. And I think that's something that our great social movements today could take some lessons from, because it is important, as Dennis and Nicole have said, it's often that you have to pass it along to another generation to keep pushing, to keep expanding, to keep making those promises. And in terms of education, of course, the suffragists did think of that. The one wing of the movement establishes the League of Women Voters, which is also celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, has done a remarkable job of educating the population, women and men, on as Nicole said, who is running, what are the issues, how do you make decisions? And then we have the other part of the movement, Alice Paul and her Women's Party, draft the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced in Congress in 1923. And that was to tackle all the other legal disadvantages that women are under. As we know, it's still not fully ratified.
And can I say something to you? One of your respondents asked a very important question. One of the people on the chat, and I wanted to publicly talk about this really quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time, but one important component about policy reform is the implementation. Right? We have elected officials that jump on the next sexy thing. Back when Out for Justice first started back in 2006, around 2003, 2009, reentry was not popular. People did not want to stand up and talk about the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and we were, right? And so it's important that when legislators introduce these laws, that we are making sure that the policy is implemented, that we're staying on them to say, listen, those agencies, those stakeholders who is going to be responsible for ensuring that this law works is actually working. And the idea of putting a polling place in the jails in Baltimore, first of all, we are not Illinois. We are not Chicago. If I just told you earlier, Maryland can't even get the basics right? We can't even make sure that people understand the law. We had actual election representatives misquoting the law, right? So we want to make sure that the basics is done. We want to make sure that Departments of Corrections and local wardens have the tools necessary to ensure that people have their right to vote, right? And so let's not put the cart before the horse, because it's a sexy thing to do right now. Let's make sure that the law that exists, the current law, the 2016 veto override exists. Let's make sure that the State Board of Elections is putting it out loud and clear that individuals who had, I apologize, y'all, my phone is just ringing off the hook. Let's make sure that the current law is actually working. Let's give ourselves some time to be able to have the State Board of Elections figure out the capacity that they have, to make sure that they have the capacity to really implement these policies. And let's make sure that the State Board of Elections is able to get the support they need from the advocates. Let's make sure that the local Board of Elections are able to actually implement the law. I'm not opposed to voting machines, but I am opposed to jumping to the next big thing because everybody else is doing it, when in fact, we don't even have a statewide protocol on how people should access their right to vote.
Thank you, Nicole. We are out of time, so I apologize that we have not been able to get to the Q&A. We have put both books as well as Nicole's Out for Justice website in our chat box, and when we do our follow-up, we'll make sure to have those. So if you want to be a part of the activism, you can learn how to help. But I think what we've really learned here is that voter suppression inevitably is trying to take the power away from the people. And the best thing you can do is try and take that power back. As a voter, if there's long lines, if you can't find a ballot box and do extra work and it's very hard to vote, there's a reason. Someone is trying to keep your voice from being heard. And that's all the more reason to use your power. I think Martha is going to hop on and do our closing. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Elaine, Dennis, and Nicole. We really appreciate your time and expertise in talking about this subject. Like Ali said, we will be sending out a follow-up email with resources for you all to continue learning about voter suppression and the history of voter suppression. Thanks for attending, especially those of you who are members. We really rely on your support to continue providing this free virtual programming. I encourage you all to visit our website, mdhistory.org, to take a look at membership benefits and levels, but also take a look at our upcoming free virtual programs. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you to all our panelists.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.